I wanted just to give you a brief introduction of how this book came about, which was begun in the 1980s. When I was at university at Berkeley, I was enrolled in a science course with the thought of becoming a physician. So given my background, when I was called up to do my military training, I was attached to the preventive medicine unit at the field hospital where I was stationed. I remained there for the 2 years of my national service, during which time I became familiar with the detective work involved in tracking down the origin of communicable disease. Later, when I became interested in plant biology and started looking into the ideas that were being mooted in the scientific literature on redesigning plants through genetic engineering, which led me to consider the nature of the food industry, the industrialization of agribusiness, and the connection with government in promoting the idea of bioengineering as a vital economic force, I began to consider what happens when something goes wrong, how government and corporate agencies provide cover for mistakes that might impinge on future high-tech funding. All this came together in 1981 when I first read about what became known as the toxic oil scandal in Spain, where many thousands became seriously ill due to what seemed to be contaminated cooking oil. The cause was traced to the consumption of oil that had been intended for industrial use. The cheap industrial oil that had been refined and then sold as olive oil by street vendors at various open-air markets. It was thought that toxic compounds derived during the refinement process were responsible for the severe reactions. Sometime later, however, various researchers began questioning this hypothesis. They pointed out that a number of people diagnosed with the syndrome claimed that they hadn't consumed the oil. Others hadn't been in the location where the oil was sold. An alternative theory began to be explored, one which suggested a cover-up by the Spanish government. And it was this alternative theory that became the basis for writing Technofarm. So I'll read you a bit of the first chapter so you can get a flavor of what I was trying to do. Chapter 1, Tuesday, the 21st of June, 1994. The subterranean offices in the great red Victorian building, where darkness and gloom were built in like a moral prerogative, had once been used to hide the fresh corpses which had been offered to the medical school by the special procurers whose methods and supplies were rarely questioned by the college. They were hungry for cadavers to be butchered by clumsy students, trying vainly to slice through the middle lamella of the lumbar fascia without botching up a kidney, or so the story was told to Grant when he first moved in several years before. He had done what he could to brighten the place up, covering the walls with tapestries and masks from his time in Africa, Buddhist sculptures from his visits to the Far East, Mayan artifacts from trips to South America, and other knickknacks from expeditions to the four corners of the globe when he had been on the payroll of the World Health Organization. But whatever he did, the dour air of the place, tinged with traces of formaldehyde, always seemed to filter through, straining his precious objects with a rather off-putting yellow, so that in the end he took them back to his cramped apartment overlooking the British Museum. It was a few minutes after he had come back to his office from the lecture. He was looking over a student paper, finding himself bored to tears, not so much from disinterest, but from the sloppy workmanship. The paper had clearly been done in a rush over a midnight bottle of Blanc, he suspected. There was even a few reddish stains as evidence. No thought had been put into it, not even an attempt at analysis, just something dashed off in the wee hours of the morning and handed in like a bag of dirty socks. He put the paper down with disgust. Why should he care, he wondered, and then he realized he didn't. It suddenly dawned on him, something he had known all the time. He hated teaching. When he had left his job at the World Health Organization, he had been suffering from what had been called fatigue. It wasn't an extraordinary diagnosis for someone who had traveled from disaster to disaster, from the latest drug-resistant strain of malaria in Burma to outbreaks of ancient bubonic plague in the highlands of Mexico. He could feel the gradual change coming over him long ago, from a youthful idealist on the front lines of the battle against pandemics to the mature pragmatist balancing the possible with the likely and making do with what he could get. Then came the accident at Seveso, which put a mighty dent in his brightly polished armor, though he could have lived with that since he was still convinced that he had acted properly. But it was his time in Africa, 2 grueling years in Kenya, doing a study on the AIDS epidemic that finally threw him over the brink. What he had witnessed there was, in terms of absolute horror, beyond anything he had ever seen. Even now, it continued to haunt him like an apocalyptic apparition. In his mind, he would see that endless highway stretching from Nairobi to Mombasa. Along the road, all the truck stops, tiny villages with lean-to hovels, tin roofs baking in the blazing sun, heating up the stinking rooms like ovens. There sat beer halls with slat wood benches and sticky tables, the tiny huts scattered in the backyards for the truckers, dirty mattresses on the muddy ground, women in thin, dry lips and open sores on their arms and bony legs so wasted they could hardly keep the stained skirts above their lanky hips. Every stop along the route had that same rank odor of beer and stale cum, like bodies lifeless, gaunt, defiled as the land, which stretched out flat and dry and grimy as far as he could see. At the end of the road was the hospital, its wards overflowing with matchstick limbs, crammed into rooms without beds, naked in the damnable heat but too gaunt to sweat, faces with sunken eyes and lifeless heads, no longer black but an ash in the shade of gray. They lingered on, half dead, clinging to a sort of zombie life that made living an obscenity. That was the land he lived in now, not only at night when those terrible images would flood his mind, but sometimes during lectures or meetings it would happen in an instant, like a black talon ripping through his head, and rather than fading quietly into the dark corners of his brain, as most obsessions do given time, they seemed to be coming more frequently. It was also why teaching had become such a burden to him. This morning, for example, when he had first come in and looked around at the students quietly seated in the semicircular rows that ascended the balcony of a miniature opera house in dizzying abruptness, he had hardly recognized a single one, though this was the final lecture of the term. Even as he spoke, he kept glancing involuntarily in the direction of a large, bald-headed man taking copious notes, who stared at the lectern with grotesque eyes that seemed to bulge from his face, and he couldn't help thinking this person either had a thyroid condition or else was a serious lunatic. His lecture had ended with his ideas on the general nature of poisons. The first rule to remember is that everything is a poison. The second rule, seemingly a contradiction of the first, is that nothing is a poison. The third rule is that substances which are poisonous to one organism in the biological continuum are not necessarily poisonous to another. The fourth rule, a corollary of the third, is that substances toxic to one individual of a species are not necessarily toxic to another. He looked up and noticed the expression of dismay on several youngest faces. If this sounds confusing, he went on, we all only ourselves to blame, for poison is one of those words that science could readily do without. Labeling some substance as a poison is similar to labeling an individual as evil. Whatever we say about that person in the future, the notion of evil remains like a bad taste overriding every other impression we might have had. The same is true with a substance labeled poison. Whatever else it might be, once labeled, it forever lingers in the mind. In fact, what we have seen is that any substance, any chemical or plant extract can have either therapeutic or toxic effects on a particular organism. The equation will depend on two things, dosage and an individual's specific constitution at a certain point in time. All we can say with certainty is that the lesser quantity is curative and the greater is injurious. But the exact quantity is always relative. Rabbits can tolerate great amounts of atropine, They can be fed for weeks on roots, berries, and leaves of Atropa belladonna. They can also consume quantities of cocaine that would destroy most humans without showing signs of ill effects. Berries from the deadly nightshade plant can be eaten with seeming impunity by blackbirds, but they are often fatal to pigs and sheep. Spotted hemlock, disastrous to certain imbibing philosophers, can be easily tolerated by goats. Asperula odorata, on the other hand, can be eaten by humans, but are often deadly to geese. For belladonna and hemlock, the toxic or therapeutic effects on humans are well known. But how about other plants that we classify as foods? Take the mainstay of an ordinary stew, for example. How many of us know that the common potato can induce fits in some unlikely soul? Or that turnips can make some people suffer from breathlessness? Or that radishes in your salad can make someone extremely ill from toxicological effects? None of us would have the audacity to call potatoes, turnips, or radishes poisons, but that's exactly what they are to some. It was here that he stopped, focusing his eyes on a young woman in the third row who was waving her hand in the air. There was nothing more disturbing to him than losing his train of thought in mid-sentence. He raised an eyebrow as a sign of impatience. Is it urgent, Miss? Janet Haskell, Ms. Janet Haskell, the woman said, putting the emphasis on the titular designation. Is it urgent, Ms. Janet Haskell? He repeated with a restrained sigh. I was wondering about your basic premise, she said, totally ignoring his question as well as his desire to move on. If we did believe in evil, I suppose it would follow that I would believe in poisons too. Isn't that a semantic trap? I mean, doesn't the concept of poison serve a useful purpose both in practice and theory? And sometimes something can either be harmful or a remedy. That's not the issue. Aspirin can cure your headache or it can kill you. We don't call it a poison, though, since it's part of our basic arsenal of drugs. However, we do educate ourselves as to dosage, and we make it clear that not following prescribed amounts can lead to disastrous results. On the other hand, we do call arsenic a poison because we don't want to encourage its use by patients, even though it can and often is prescribed as a drug under a different name. I would think that toxicology is a useful branch of science only if we allow ourselves to call things by their proper names and establish definite parameters whereby we can determine cause and effect. That's what science is all about. The statement, everything is relative, leaves it all up to God. And frankly, I was hoping for a little more facts and figures. Looking down at my notes, I can find little I can use except to be careful with radishes and potatoes. You have a question, I suppose, Grant asked patiently, even though he felt his stomach turn. Well, I suppose my question is this. As future epidemiologists, how do we make sense of everything you said? I mean, how, for heaven's sake, will we use it? Part of him half admired her brashness, and maybe it was a fair question after all, he thought. Well, from an epidemiological perspective, he replied, we would like to know how a certain pollutant in the environment will affect the natural habitat, or more specifically, what its toxic effect will be on humans. Unfortunately, we cannot do this. We can only say that from past experience, a certain toxin released into the environment will be dangerous and probably will cause certain problems. But we can never be sure which individuals will be affected and what will be their reaction. For example, in July 1976, an accident took place in the town of Seveso in Italy. A plant that manufactured trichlorophenol, a chemical used to make antiseptics, released a large amount of diabenzene into the atmosphere, contaminating an area of about 700 acres. Within a week, a number of children were hospitalized with chloramine, and animals, sheep, dogs, cows, horses began dying. The soil in an established radial area around the plant was analyzed and was found to contain high levels of dioxin. Grant stopped for a moment and looked at the young woman who had challenged him. He could see she was concentrating on his words. As the epidemiologist in charge, Miss Haskell, what would you have done? She didn't hesitate. Her response was immediate. Because of the high levels of dioxin found in the soil, and since dioxin is known to be a tetragen in animals, all the women who were living in the exposed zone during their first trimester of pregnancy should have been offered therapeutic abortions. In fact, that is exactly what was done, Ms. Haskell, on the advice of toxicologists who, as I said, had studied the effect of dioxin on animals. Of the 150 contacted, 30 had abortions performed despite the resistance of the Catholic Church. The young woman nodded her head approval. However, of the 120 remaining women who gave birth, there were only 2 who bore children with anomalies, one with intentional obstruction, the other with a genital malformation, both of which were corrected by surgery. It still was the correct decision, said the woman. The advice on therapeutic abortions was given by toxicologists, one of whom was also an epidemiologist brought in to study the situation. It may have been the proper advice based on the statistical data he had in hand. But I would be surprised if there wasn't some doubt later, some qualms. Maybe that has more to say about the scientists than the science, Janet Haskell retorted, meeting aside with a harsh, condemning look. Without being able to make decisions based on statistical knowledge, what value is epidemiology? Grant felt extremely tired and his head hurt the way it did when he was coming down with the flu. He was about to say something he would have regretted, but looking out at the younger students in the audience, he saw that they were fidgeting in their seats, seemingly embarrassed, so he ended by directing his final statement to them. Epidemiologists, he said, are more like detectives than physicians. And like detectives, they can neither prevent a murder or bring back the dead, but they can sometimes help to prevent more killings by finding the source of the gun. And who it was that pulled the trigger. And in times like these, as keepers of a very troubled world, we need all the bloody help we can get.